Hi, Dr. McGrath is back with review video number 4. And this is your last review video. And the 4th chapter is actually quite short, so this should be a shorter video, I hope, unless I go off on some tangent. But we'll see. Hopefully not. The last chapter, chapter 4, is about form. And what you need to know for the exam is that form, in its most general definition, defines the arrangement, relationship, or organization of the elements of music. Did you get that? I'll say it again. Form, in its general sense, describes the arrangement, relationship, or organization of the elements of music. Now, what are the elements of music? That's not necessarily on the exam, but you should know because we've been reviewing them. The elements of music are things like melody, rhythm, harmony, those kind of things, dynamics, tone color, all of those things come together to create music. And form is kind of a way that we organize those different things. So I told you though that that's form in the general sense, but there is also form in a more specific sense, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit. Okay, now another way of looking at it is that form is kind of how music is put together. And what you need to know is that the way that these compositions are put together has to do with two main things: repetition and contrast. So basically, form ends up being created by the idea that if we present something, we present an idea, a melody or a tune, that at some point that's going to be contrasted, that we're going to get some kind of other melody, most likely, something that will contrast in some way, and that often that melody is going to return in some way. It might be modified, it might be different. Now the thing that you need to know is that to hear form, you need to have memory. You need to be able to remember. So let's say, there's some people who have had brain injuries and they're unable to access their long-term memory. They would not be able to hear form in music very well. You need to be able to remember that an idea happened. You need to be able to identify that, somehow hold it in your brain to recognize when it comes back. And that's something you need to work on developing. And hopefully this class will really help you to develop that ability. And just identifying the elements of music is going to help us to identify the form of a piece of music. Okay, so I'll go over that again. You need to know what form is. We went over what form is. And you need to also realize that form is created. A musical composition takes on its general form by means of repetition and contrast. Again, repetition and contrast are the two things that help a composition to take on its form. They're ways that composers create form using those two elements. And the main skill involved in hearing form, I already went over that. What's the main skill? What do you need to be able to do to hear form? You need musical memory. You need to remember what's happened, what's come before, and you need to be able to identify when it's different and then identify when it returns. Okay, now when we're mapping out form, it's kind of a way of categorizing parts of a composition. When we're mapping out form, we can map out an outer form as well as the inner form. The outer form is the most form in the most general sense. And quite often, well, pretty much always when we're identifying form, we're going to use a method of classification that uses letters. Now these letters aren't pitches. It's a different form. It's more like when you're writing out an outline, and we'll use letters. So an A would represent the first idea. An A will represent the first idea. So if we present a general idea, let's say for example, a composer has some beautiful little melody that's established, or a tune that has a few phrases, that has a beginning, that has an end, and then they do something that's contrasting in some way. Well, the first section would be called the A section, and it would be capital A. Then the contrasting idea, which often is almost the same length, or maybe longer, but some contrasting idea would be a B, and then our return would be an A again. So an example of a form would be A, B, A. I can define that as a specific type of music might have that form, A, B, A. In fact, that's really, really typical. A lot of pop music does that too, where B would represent the chorus and A would represent the verse. So you get that? It's pretty neat. Now, what that means, though, is that if I told you that a composition has the form A, B, A would represent the return portion, because it comes back, and B would represent, or the repetition, and B would represent the contrasting section. Now here's a question for you. Which form would have more contrast? A form that uses many letters like A, B, C, D, even if A keeps repeating. If I use like the letter B, the letter C, the letter D, would that have more contrast than a form that maybe only uses 2 letters like A, B, A, B, A? What's the answer to that? Well, the one that uses more letters has more contrast. That means I have to use a new letter because that section is so different that I need to use a different letter to represent it. So if you see a form that has the letter B, the letter C, the letter D, etc., that's going to have more contrast than a form that only uses, for example, the letters A and B. So the more letters that are used, the more contrast is represented. Now there's another neat thing that happens, and that is that sometimes something will return, but it will be slightly changed, just slightly, enough so that you can still tell it's familiar, but maybe it's been harmonized differently. You remember what harmonized means. If you don't, you need to go look it up, because that was in one of the other review videos. It might be harmonized differently, or maybe it will be in minor in a different mode. For example, it might have originally been in major, and maybe just one element of music is changed, and it's made into minor. That's pretty cool, actually, and that's done quite often in classical compositions. It's very interesting when you notice that. What we can do when we're looking at that is we can still go, for example, we can use the A again if it's a return, but what we might do is we might put a little apostrophe on that A. All that means is that it's slightly different. It's slightly changed from the original A, enough for it to be something slightly different, but not contrasting enough to use a separate letter. So that's something you should be aware of. Now, we're talking about outer form, the big form, but also within a composition there's also an inner form. An inner form might be that the A section itself might have inside of it contrasting sections. And so within that larger A, we might have a little a and then maybe a little b. So we use those little letters to show the inner form, and we use the larger letters to use the outer form. That's something you should be familiar with, but especially you should be familiar with the idea of repetition and contrast, with the idea that the capital letters represent outer form, with the idea that the A, if it keeps repeating, represents repetition, where the B would represent, for example, contrast, if we've got a form such as ABA. You need to remember, this is easy, you need to remember that you need musical memory to hear form, for you to know what's come before and what is contrasting and what's different. What else do you need to know? Gosh. I think that's it. That's all you need to know for form. So I think I've done a really thorough review of the exam. I would guess that I've covered every single question and every single answer on the exam in these 5 videos. So make sure to watch them really carefully, study hard, make sure you know the difference between frequency and amplitude and rhythm, the definition of rhythm, all of those definitions of any of the terms that are listed on the concept sheet you should be familiar with. Make sure that you don't think that a saxophone is brass, because it's not, it's the woodwind. And make sure also that you're ready to write a little bit about consonance and dissonance. That's probably one of the trickiest questions. It's the only question that requires you actually writing a few questions. Everything else is multiple choice, but you're going to have to write a few sentences for a question about consonance and dissonance. Remember that that's referring to the element of harmony in this case, and you'll need to know that consonance is about feeling at rest. Dissonance is that contrast, it creates tension, and that without those things, music might be a little bit boring. That we need to have a feeling of rest, and to have a feeling of rest, we need to have a feeling of tension. You should remember that melodies usually have a climax, and that's important too. And gosh, I've covered everything. You guys can ace this. If you watch these and you take notes and you came to class regularly, there's no excuse for you getting below an 80 on this exam. So I'm looking forward to grading those exams and finding out how well you've done. And I will see you on Tuesday of next week. Make sure you're there for the exam, and I'll see you soon. So goodbye from upstate New York.